Chapter 18. The Era of Termination and Relocation. The Post-War Shift, from Preservation to Termination. Following World War II, the United States entered an era defined by intense patriotism, McCarthyism, and a drive for national conformity. This cultural climate sparked a move to fully integrate ethnic minorities into the American mainstream. For the federal government, this was also a fiscal strategy. By ending special support for Native American tribes, the government aimed to reduce its post-war debt and administrative burden. The policy shifted from assimilation to a more radical concept called termination. While earlier policies like the Dawes Act sought to change Indian culture, termination aimed to legally dissolve tribal nations entirely. It meant the end of the federal government's role as a guardian, stripping away tribal sovereignty and treating Native Americans strictly as individual citizens with no special rights or federal protections. The legislative foundation. Between 1940 and 1950, a series of laws prepared the ground for this transition. The Indian Claims Commission Act of 1946 was established to settle past grievances and treaty violations, hoping that financial payouts would provide tribes with a foundation for self-reliance before their status was terminated. Further legal changes, such as Public Law 280 in 1953, transferred criminal and civil jurisdiction from the federal government to state governments in several states. By 1953, a joint congressional resolution officially announced termination as the national goal, targeting tribes that were deemed economically self-sufficient for immediate dissolution. The Indian Relocation Act of 1956. To accelerate the disappearance of tribal identities, the government enacted the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. This law incentivized Native Americans to leave their reservations and move to major urban centers like Los Angeles, Denver, and San Francisco. The government provided moving expenses and temporary living stipends to encourage this migration. The demographic shift was massive. By 1960, over 31,000 people had left the reservations. By 1980, that number surged to 750,000. However, the reality of city life was often grim. Isolated from their communities and facing systemic racial discrimination, many relocated Indians were trapped in low-wage labor. High urban living costs and a lack of support systems turned many into the urban poor, creating a cycle of poverty that was difficult to escape. The harm of the termination policy. The impact of termination between 1953 and 1964 was devastating. More than 100 tribes and bands lost their official recognition. Roughly 12,000 people, or 3% of the total native population at the time, were stripped of their tribal status, and 10,000 square kilometers of land were removed from federal trust protection. The Menominee Tribe of Wisconsin serves as the most prominent example of this failure. Before termination, the Menominee were economically prosperous, owning a successful sawmill and managing vast forest resources. After their status was terminated in 1954, their tax burdens skyrocketed, their sawmill fell into deficit, and the community plummeted into poverty. By the time the policy was reversed in 1973, the Menominee unemployment rate had reached a staggering 40%. Ironically, the government ended up spending significantly more on welfare for the Menominee after termination than it had ever spent on tribal support before the policy began. The return to self-determination. The 1960s civil rights movement eventually forced a re-evaluation of these destructive policies. Presidents Johnson and Nixon began advocating for self-determination, the idea that tribes should manage their own affairs while maintaining their sovereign status. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 effectively signaled the end of the termination era. It took until 1988 for the termination policy to be officially discarded by a joint congressional resolution. In the decades since, many tribes have fought long and expensive legal battles to restore their recognized status. As of early 2026, the Bureau of Indian Affairs recognizes 575 tribal nations as sovereign entities within the United States. This current era acknowledges that the strength of the nation lies not in the forced erasure of indigenous identities, but in the recognition of their enduring cultural and political sovereignty.